All right. Well, yeah. This sort of started because you left that. I thought it was a very honest. It was a very honest comment that expressed the sentiments of a lot of people who contact me, and I think follow this channel. And I'm glad you got in touch with me and are willing to follow up.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear more of your story and more of your experience. And is that a cat playing in the curtains?
Yeah. Yes.
First the little
Yeah.
girls and now the cat want in on the video.
Yeah. No, they were curious. They really wanted to see what was going on.
So
But yeah,
so
I'm curious what your thoughts are on, what makes people's responses to your videos so similar. Like, what's going on in the minds of people who are trying to navigate this space, especially when it's new to them. Like, what have you found?
well, let's start with your story if that's okay.
Yeah,
I don't know how much of your story you want to share or what, you know, depending on how the conversation goes. I can send it to you to review if you're concerned about it. We don't have to publish it. I mean, that's the way all my conversations go, because not everybody wants or their story up on the internet. So how were you raised? Did you go to church? Was religion a part of it? Good experience, bad experience?
yeah. I would say that my family was they had some beliefs, but I always felt like they didn't express those. They didn't force them onto me, and really didn't like me. We may have went to church a couple times, but it doesn't seem like it seemed like they just had a very general notion of morality, of be good, and it seemed like it was a very secular type of religious belief, but that there was little plaques on the wall that talked about God, but that was pretty much the only exposure I got in that way. I went to like, my parents worked at NASA, and so they worked a lot, and I got raised essentially by the public school system and my peers, and so a lot of trying to navigate my perspective of the world was kind of just looking at human behavior, and thinking that math and science and history had something to do with learning about the world, and that seemed to make intuitive sense to me. But so that's how, like, that was like the focal point of early childhood, as far as like building this model of what all this was. And by the time I had really come to religion at all, it was more through looking historically at just all of the stuff that has happened in the past and the religious conflicts. And I was raised in Texas, and there was a lot of not family, but just people that I knew that I guess left a bad taste in my mouth. One of the churches that my family did go to, when they did, it was like there's like a kids center and people were playing video games, and it didn't seem like they were really taking, it seemed like it was just a place for the kids to have fun while the parents were doing church. And there was a couple times where I had tried to ask questions, and I was just very inquisitive, and that was not received very well. And I just remember feeling like, if I'm confused, that whole sentiment is now like, you just should stay confused, or like you shouldn't, this shouldn't be the way that you're approaching this. And so I guess that was like not a good start for me to try to get a sense of the community aspect of it, because I think that's what mostly makes people feel identified with it, and allows them to get kind of further into their relationship with it, is through this feeling like they belong to something. And I when I was young, like in early teenage, I started to get like a lot of mental problems, depression and suicidal ideation, and just difficulty making it through school and these types of things. And so they had me on medications, and I would go in and out of these like psychiatric wards, and this medication that they had me on, just like tons of different medication, was really screwing up my mind. And so I was kind of just hanging on by a thread for most of my early life like that. So but I think through all that, I wanted to have something to live for, and it felt like the what was available, the you go to school and you get a job, and like that whole narrative just seemed to not give me anything. And so I feel like I tried to look elsewhere to try to find something of more substance, and another narrative to live my life by. Um, uh, so I found shamanism at first. Like that was the first thing I found. I really, before I met my wife, I was gonna move to Peru and live in the Amazon, and I really admired the way the indigenous people live, just living off the land and not wasting. And I kind of just found it in strict contrast to the way we live in America. And so that was it was kind of telling the story kind of comes out chaotic, because it was kind of, I didn't know what I was doing, and then I found something that made me feel more connected with things, with the earth. And that just gradually evolved from there. Once I found something like that, it allowed me to break that frame. Like I feel like the core of shamanic experience, or religious experience, whatever you want to call it, allowed me to kind of disintegrate that really cynical, alienated feeling that I had, feeling so out of place in the world. And so I think once I started to calm down in that way and kind of get over all my stuff, then it kind of freed my mind up to be able to look at these ways of seeing the world that previously were just not alive for me. And so yeah, I actually around the time I was 17, 18, I had like found the atheist experience, and I was very anti-religious. So my mind became preoccupied with this thing, but I kind of slipped into this groove. And Matt Dillahunty in particular, like I just found it could not make sense to me. Like I felt like what I had said in my comment about, in my mind, a thing that does something like create a universe, that it like, what is omnipresence? Like what is a being that's omnipresent, or what is that thing's consciousness like, to where when you write it in a book, that it would sound so much like a human consciousness. Like it would sound so much like the way a human thinks, the way we interact with people that do us wrong. And like it just seemed like you can tell that the angle it's being written from has to be filtered through a human being, and that it was hard for me to feel like God plays favorites, or that this thing isn't somehow enmeshed in the whole fabric of life itself, where someone lost in the jungle has a connection to God, or that thing isn't ingrained into the fibers of our being somehow, and not based on like a certain kind of belief, like you have to believe a certain type of doctrine. And it just felt like people were so bad at that, like objectively, even from the Christian's perspective. It's like the goal of life being a race, and we only have nubs instead of legs. Like we're missing the one thing we're supposed to have for our salvation.
Huh.
And that just seemed
Huh.
like I can't wrap my head around that.
Nubs instead of legs. That's really good. When you say the one thing we need for our salvation, what do you mean by salvation?
Well, it's more of a caricature of what I hear from some people. Since that's was the way I thought about it, I've encountered a lot more sophisticated ideas of what that word means. But from the perspective of how I would ask that question then, it was like you go to heaven, and it's just eternal bliss, and Jesus is there with crackers and water, and like so I mean, that was kind of the way it was portrayed to me. And like you have an image, you can't build an image in your mind, but I still had the image of salvation as just everlasting peace and bliss with with people you've loved in your life, or your family, and stuff like that. So I don't know, to me it just seemed like I didn't like the feeling of thinking I was going to live forever in any form. Like I didn't want to be me forever. Like that just seemed like like it would have to be bad after a little bit, or that I don't know how, if it's such an exclusive place, that you could be happy knowing that most of all humanity was in another place, and that just that could be righteous to you just seemed like that really put me off. Like, how do I go towards this thing when it just feels so wrong, that like this whole setup? And so yeah, I felt like it was impossible for me to force myself to believe that the actual accuracy of a belief would be the thing that your fate hinges on. And I understand that I still think it was right that that acts don't do it, that somehow it's just a gift from God, that it's just this thing that out of the kindness of its heart that it gives to people. I understand that the hubris and feeling attached to being the helper or the good person that does good, and then you get wrapped up in that role, and then it just becomes a source of pride for you. So I can understand that as well, but it just seems so strange that that this thing that you really couldn't control, which is what you believe, like what made sense to you, would be the thing that you had to rely on and lean on. And I guess for me, it's not that I'm like trying to push myself towards a certain thing. I know that it can't be that kind of pushing myself to do that, because it just feels so forced. Like I don't want it to be forced. I want it to be something that I'm doing out of really desiring it or wanting it. Yeah, and I don't see myself being able to completely shirk off the kind of Darwinian way that I interpret my reality, and like to feel as though human beings are completely the center of this show, this this thing that's happening in the story, when just to think how weird it is that there's so many millions of plant species, there's millions of insect species, and it's just like, why did this thing put octopus at the bottom of the ocean and do stuff like that? It seems like this thing's mind is like way out there, like making a weird thing like an octopus. It's like, it seems like its intention on was like life itself, and not this subset of life, that its mind could stretch out that far and not have to just be singly focused on this one part of life. But yeah, I guess it's difficult for me to think about reconciling this like normative goal that I have to be like Christ, because the more I think about what a good life is, and the more I experience that like agape feeling of like, for my kids or for just strangers, like I'll be out driving my car and I'll feel this immense love for people, and it's like the love is directly correlated to understanding. Like, you see all the little things that make up these people's lives and how their lives have unfolded, and it's just like seeing the intricacy of that makes you love them and understand them. Like the way, especially if they treat people in a certain way, it's like you see the reflection of the pain that's causing them to like just tense up and not be able to, they can't unravel their own stuff, and so they're kind of trapped in a certain way of being, and you just have this deep compassion and just want to be there for people and to try to make them feel supported and all this kind of stuff. And so I recognize that there is this moral obligation that I feel like I have to emulate that character and to understand the symbolism that's inherent in the Bible. But as far as looking at Adam and Eve as a historical document, or looking at these things from the perspective that I feel like within the bounds of the narrative that I'm supposed to believe it in a certain kind of way, and it doesn't, I don't feel like I'm getting closer to that, and I feel like very conflicted trying to think of this process as a renouncing old, this naturalistic way of thinking. It's really hard for me to feel like I'm trying to abandon that when there's so much convergence in it, and it's like that convergence of all those different factors, and it just, to me, it seems like an impossible thing to manage.
There's a few things that stand out. One is the question of qualification, and when you talk about I'm supposed to believe in a certain kind of thing, and you rightly note that, well, that's a little bit of a conundrum, because you're exhorted to believe as if the process of believing is somehow volitional. That, okay, so I'm told to believe as if it's a choice to take, let's say, the red pill or the blue pill. Well, take the blue pill. Well, that's a different kind of thing than being exhorted to believe. Yet at the same time, that's this exhortation to believe a particular thing is almost always an assumed portion of almost every human speech and assertion. If all advertising is an exhortation to believe that Coke tastes better than Pepsi, to believe that driving a Lincoln will make your life complete, to believe that Apple truly has better computers and isn't just one of the most successful marketing corporations we've ever known. There's a lot going on there. And so then in some ways, the church comes to you and says, well, this is what you have to believe. And if you believe that, that is a qualification for then this salvation, which is in and of itself not terribly easy to sort of get your mind around and articulate. I like how you talked about, Jesus giving crackers almost as if it is like that little children's set aside children's ministry to keep the children happy and safe while the parents are in the big room, getting what they want. It's interesting to go all the way back to where you started talking in terms of this. We come into this life through a passage that obviously is not of our own choosing. No one asks to be born. No one, at least to our knowledge, says born or not born, you get to choose one way or the other. And then, of course, you're born to a different family. You're born to a particular time. You're born to a particular existence. You have capacities and potentials and all of these things, none of which you choose. And then you go out into the world. And of course, you very quickly begin to understand that in this world, there's this mixture of pain and pleasure, and lots of different people get very different mixes of that. And it's not even only a part of what they choose or even what their parents chose for them. You have genetic backgrounds, you have all of these things going on. And at some point, you're going to wake up enough to notice that meaning is pretty important. And what does it all mean? The new atheists are an interesting addition to the conversation in the sense that they, in some ways, attempt to debunk the traditional meaning-making solutions, but the art of debunking itself can be a very meaningful process as well. And being part of the community of debunkers can be a meaningful part of the process as well. And so you actually, in a rather ironic way, establish a new church, sort of an anti-church, but then people want from that new anti-church all of the kinds of things that they are attempting to debunk, which has been providing the meaning and the community and all of those things for people historically. And listening to someone like, say, Sam Harris with his Glenn Lowry conversation recently, expressing frustration that for all of the supposed rationality and smarts and enlightenment that they possess, they still find it incredibly difficult to actually deliver upon the implicit promises that meaning-making community suggests to people. That if you debunk via the Enlightenment all of these old stories, and if you apply via the Enlightenment all of the rationality and science that we now possess, then we can secure for ourselves that which we desire. When, if you pursue it a little bit further, you begin to recognize that all of the rationality and meaning making and science and enlightenment isn't really helping us even articulate that which we desire. In other words, there's somehow within us a hole that we are constantly trying to fill, but it seems like sometimes the more stuff we throw down that hole, and when we look down that hole and we see we don't seem to be getting any closer to filling it, we experience again some of that despair. So then you turn around and you come to the church again, and the church also seems to hold out something of an invitation and an assurance of consumer satisfaction, let's say. But all of the, in many ways, good points that the atheist debunkers have been throwing out continue to linger, because part and parcel of the church's invitation is laden with many of these things that certainly have felt to have been debunked. And so therefore you're sort of in a fix. And okay, so move to Peru, somehow see if you can join an indigenous community that is living off the land, and at least from an outside perspective, reliably advantaging themselves of sort of the most basic natural meaning-making mechanisms that humanity has long participated in. Whereas you very quickly get the sense that, and this is where we sort of get into the technology conversation, the desire, the meaningful pursuit of resolution of problems implicitly leads to the embrace of technology, which undermines the need to which the pursuit, that the satisfaction of which was so meaningful. And so in other words, you can go to the, if in fact you could go to the Amazon rainforest and somehow embed yourself in an indigenous community, which, if you know much of anything about these communities, is at the beginning extremely unlikely, because even going to such a place, you would be severely pressured, because on one hand, you're struggling to make fire and hunt for yourself and feed yourself, knowing all the well that, well, back in the good old USA, one way or another, through a food bank and even a job at McDonald's, you can reliably sustain yourself, even if not as meaningfully as, say, pursuing the hunt. So there's a whole realm of stuff out there. And when I listen to you sort of, when I ask you a very hard question, it seems like an easy question, but it's actually an extraordinarily hard question, which is what your comment bore witness to. There are a myriad of complex elements to this question that are in no way easily or quickly addressed. And you also have the intuitive sense that the addressing of these questions isn't simply a matter of stating answers in the way that we can communicate now via this Zoom call. Well, I'm just going to give you the answer and then you're going to have it. But that the meaningful pursuit of these questions is in fact not so much a well-crafted paragraph, but is in effect a life, and a life that by necessity involves all of the things that life involves: relationships, children, cats, jobs, all of the things that you are in fact involved in every day. So all of that is to say that even though you might feel that this is all vague and frustrating and perhaps hopelessly confused, I don't find your answer to my question confused at all. I think you are barking up the right tree. And in some ways, part of what you are challenging the church with is a challenge to say, hey, wait a minute, you're sort of offering me something that's a little bit simplified. And I've seen enough life to know that I'm kind of in a trap. Because on one hand, you say the answer to all of these dilemmas is believing in Jesus, let's say, but there's all of these reasons for which I can't really seem to just fall into line in the ways that you all appear to have fallen into line and are deriving a degree of comfort, satisfaction, meaning, and community from being able to fall in line. And so therefore, you sort of leave me stuck, because I can't just concoct a belief in Jesus without, of course, listening to Matt Dillahunty or Sam Harris and all of these debunkings in my head. And if I can't do that, I probably can't even participate in your community, which, you know, on the outside, well, certainly has its issues and problems, but to another degree looks, at least even from the outside, like you actually do have some things going for you, even if you don't really even know all that you have going for you, having seen the alternative, which is just sort of out there, having to sort of make it on my own. Is all of that a fair assessment, or did I just completely waste 5 minutes of your time?
No, I love that. It didn't take me but a couple years to find that kind of
Keep talking. I gotta turn on my fan.
Yeah, let me do that too. All right, so the one thing that I found about the kind of community, I guess, that's built around debunking was that it kind of felt to me like it had the attitude of a 4-year-old that knocks over blocks every time you try to put up blocks. And it just had that, like, all I got to do is say what you're saying is bullshit. And like that's my only job, it seems like, because if I'm standing nowhere, then I don't have to justify myself. And it kind of feels like a cop-out a little bit to me. So I felt very put off by that I wanted to find the presence of something, not the absence of something, because that hollowness kind of ate at me. And there's so much conflict in the world. There's too many things that require of you to find some kind of integrating substance that kind of brings all these different elements of suffering and love and joy together so that they can cohere together. The place that I found in Peru, in Iquitos, that it was like a healing center. I'd found a woman named Michelle, a French woman that lived in this community, the Shipipo community, and they have like a healing center, an ayahuasca center, and I was very drawn towards that because I feel like these types of experiences have that integrating quality where it's like you see the fabric of your past, of the past of others, the way kind of history folds in on itself and creates the circumstances, and how it's like all of history lives as a ghost right now in some weird invisible way that and also there was the sense of there is this transcendent other space of existence that had some kind of sentience or some kind of benevolence to it, where like they're just this undeniable thing that once you experience something like that, you can't unsee those things, and you can't and to me, I guess I kind of already anticipate and cringe a little bit, feeling that Christians have a certain reaction to things like that because of the way certain psychedelics have been used in American culture. And I do agree that it's not just this thing that can be used in any way, and they're just good in all circumstances. But to me, I have to, there's no way that I can cast these things out and say these are just completely bad, because it just seems like without these things, I would have been in a much worse situation. That it kind of opened me up to this experience of other people that was like felt close and felt this like just deep love for all living things. And it's hard for me to spin that as and be something bad. People can say that it's, you know, artificial or that it goes away, but I mean, I've never had an experience that doesn't go away. It seems like everything washes in and out like everything else. And so just it has value in and of itself to even be able to see that space, even for a small portion of time. And that for me, I saw the connection in the brokenness of the secular world with addiction and with you know, PTSD and all these different traumas that people have that make them react to the certain, like there's certain things in their environment that are fixed, like their mom, the way their mom acts, or just these different kinds of things that my goal, if it wasn't to go to Peru and work there, me and my wife came up here to Washington to start our own thing up here. And I wanted, then as I'm kind of creating this structure for this church that would be based around the Christian ideal, and wanting to incorporate that more in very much the same way that I see, you know, Jonathan Peugeot and others like him, JP Marceau. And I really like that their approach and the way that all of you guys kind of get together and have these conversations where I can see it going somewhere. And I see for most people that are in situations like I was in, just the coming together in the pursuit of this truth and bonding, it structures itself, like it has a life of its own, and then it kind of grips the people rather than the person gripping the thing. And you know, I had developed this month-long thing that was incorporating the Dialogos and also looking at making it like kind of an academic thing where you learn philosophy and history and you kind of just come together and you talk. You know, we have some land and we're going to make it into like gardening, working in the earth, and being able to teach people how to cultivate soil and you know, be able to provide for themselves. And that these kind of like this collection of different factors would help people to feel like that back in the being mode, like they belong to the world again. And that you know, I think that just naturally brings that presence of God, of the ultimate meaning, the ultimate sense of feeling a part of things and not an alien in the world. That would help to you know, and it's such a hard thing because I don't want to appear as grandiose. I don't think I'm going to solve the problems of the world, but it seems like it's so easy to identify what the problems are, like our inability to work within our political systems effectively seem to be all kind of leading back to this meta problem of fragmentation and alienation and frustration, frustrated meaning. I got a lot from reading Viktor Frankl, and I feel like this, you know, it's so strange how, and I guess it's a product of the algorithm on the internet, that as soon as I try to like put these things together, John comes into my life and all these brilliant people that seem to be just as focused on the same problems that, you know, I think we think about applying political solutions to this thing and that thing, but I feel like this is a meta solution that if we're able to interface with problem solving in a new way, problem formulation, that we would stand a better chance. It's not going to be a thing that just, it does something, but, you don't want to get caught in this feeling that of futility, like nothing we do is going to fix these problems. Like, I just got tired of being stuck in that feeling that no matter what we do, we're self-destructive, we're going to screw ourselves over. I want to have a little bit more hope than that. And I guess like just trying to stick to that, because that's all that I can do to, I think either way, it's so far out and we don't know. And so it's better to have that more positive view, to feel like that we can all contribute to the well-being of our society, or at least our local community. Yeah.
So you're working on a project right now where you're trying to integrate some of these practices. I mean, in some ways, it sounds like you're working on John Vervaeke's program in your own small way. You've got some aspects that is cultivating and working the land. You've got some aspects that are working on dialogos. You may be integrating psychedelics. Is that what you're doing now, or is this a dream of yours, or what's the status of this project?
No, so we have the land for it already. When I was younger, I was ready to do this now, and I see it as because I'm responsible in some ways, or feel like I need to be responsible to this. I especially having a newborn and having 2 little girls, I'm homeschooling them right now. A lot of this is available whenever we want to do it. Like we could do it now if we wanted to, but I feel that I'm kind of, somewhere in the middle of this process of trying to piece all these things together and wanting to feel ready. I'm still pretty young, and I feel like mature enough to know that I need to become more mature, because it's hard to push myself to do something if I'm not ready for it. And so yeah, I don't have an exact timeline for that, but I spend almost 100% of my time reading and trying to kind of do dialectic in my head about trying to formulate a way of envisioning what this looks like. What are the actual steps? What is going to be effective for people? And a lot of it is in that imaginal space where I don't really know how it will happen. I'm very focused on using what I'm learning right now with teaching my girls. Like I'm putting all of my stock right now into being a dad, and learning how they learn. Like what is it about this mind that orients them to the world? And so that's helping me get a sense of not to call people children, but it's helping me to understand the process of helping to shape and mold a unit, to where, like, because the family is this weird nebulous thing that kind of is hard to get a hold of and get like the spirit of the family that you talked about. Like that's a very strange thing to try to navigate and get to a place where it's functioning properly, or whatever. I don't know what that means necessarily.
Well, that's right. And that's where your attention should be focused on, given given where you are right now in life, that you have young children. You're trying to You're trying to bring them up in this world in and again, this is something that we bump into again and again. And it's, this isn't not a problem for, let's say, traditional Christians, because I will, as a pastor, part of what I do is I have a lot of access to Christians. Christians are in my church, and it's my job to, it's my job to teach them. But part of that teaching, especially in this contemporary frame, is about formation and conversation. And so I'll, people will come into church with their answers. And so part of my job is to push them on their answers to see, okay, these are some words that you're carrying around with you. Do you have much beyond that words or behind that words? And can we together make a little bit more progress in terms of getting a little bit clearer, a little bit more concrete, a little bit in a little bit better way to find out where we're going? And so, my wife and I homeschooled our 5 children, not all the way through 12th grade, but at least through grade school, some of them all the way into high school. And when my wife started working, because she was, at one point, she was concerned that, we wouldn't be able to homeschool because she didn't have a teaching credential. So then she had most of the education already. So she got her teaching credential. And then ironically, she went to work in a school. And so I was homeschooling the children during the day. And then when she would get back from school, then it was quite easy for me to shift my pastor hours into afternoons and evenings, because you tend to have a lot of evening meetings and things with a church. And so I could pretty easily shift my hours into afternoons and evenings. But you learn a tremendous amount homeschooling your children, just about all sorts of things. Not only do you have to master all sorts of basic things, much of which we've forgotten since our elementary education, you have to sort of give them enough education so at some point they're going to be able to interface with the larger world out there. At the same time, it was amazing just how much a lot of homeschoolers have all this anxiety about, am I teaching them enough? Am I doing them enough? My children are all smart anyway. And once they in fact went into the larger educational system, they had no problem at all. In fact, many of the problems that they encountered when they got into the educational system had zero to do with content and had everything to do with those systems. Whereas when they were homeschooling, they could, we could work through their like basic math and grammar and, history and some of those things. We could work through those things in 3 or 4 hours, and they would have the rest of the day to, if you cut down on their screen time and all those things, you'd have the rest of the day that they could do meaningful things. They could, if they were young, they could get out and they could play in the sandbox. They could play with physical things. They could, once they got reading to a certain level, they could read a book and they could explore and they could make things. And, homeschooling is in many ways tremendously efficient and ideal in terms of giving them opportunity to do a lot of what many kids in traditional education are being starved for. We had enough children that they also had enough experience in having to deal with other human beings. Now they're human beings from a particular set, being their siblings, but they had to learn to negotiate and get along and resolve fights. And, from a perspective of all sorts of highfalutin philosophy and theology and all this kind of stuff that we talk about, sort of this thinky talky corner of the internet, that might all sound so mundane, but the truth is that all of that very basic stuff that we as human beings have to learn in our first 10, 15, 20, 25 years of life really is the participatory and the perspectival and the procedural, these other 3 Ps that Vervaeke talks about. And it's extremely rich in those. And and all psychologists, of course, figure this out. The building blocks that are sort of laid in place in those very early years are pretty foundational, using that word very intentionally to the rest of the construction that happens in life. And as I hear your story, can clearly hear elements of that. You had two very busy parents who I'm sure loved you and wanted the best for you. But when you have two people working outside the household, you have to outsource all of that attention that you, and which is really agape, that you pour into these little souls. And so, I think it sounds to me like you're doing well in terms of the fact that you are working on the basics. And even if the basics for working on the basics for you means homeschooling, parenting, raising your children, that itself is a fruitful garden out of which you will learn a tremendous amount about human beings and our nature and our desires. And in many ways, you don't need to travel to other parts of the world that are less impacted by modernity to find small spaces in the world where you can see where the knitting takes place. And I have that sense of, you see that in your homeschooling, and you have a sense that this is also found in working with living things, in terms of gardening, in terms of tilling the earth, in terms of getting a sense in the participatory and the perspectival of the basics of life and growth, and what it means to actually be an organic being in this world. So, and I also have the sense from what you said that you also know that it's a little pretentious to attractive group of people and say, I know how to live. Especially if you're, in your 30s or 40s or even your 50s, because the range of living among human beings in this world and civilization is so vastly broad that even in, say, a community like mine, which is a religious community, all of the emphasis of those whose job it is to propagate advice on living is very much contained within a tradition and an institution that says, oh, you little 50-something human being, how much do you really know? You're better off communicating the findings of the tradition rather than just, popping off your tiny little experience, which might be 50 or 60 years on this planet, as compared to the accumulated wisdom and tradition of hundreds and thousands of years. And this, in fact, is built into human beings to a degree that even the most radical progressive fails to adequately appreciate, because even their radical revolutionary progressivism is itself built on years and years and years of tradition,
Right.
Exposed by the fact that all of these people out there trying to be oh so idiosyncratic, original, and individualistic are all in many ways conforming to things that we see all over the place. And they, in fact, define their unique expressionism in the terms that all of the other the whole school and tribe of unique expressionists are all sort of doing it in the same way in some strange thing. So all of that to say that it doesn't sound like you're off to a bad start in terms of the decisions that you've been making.
Yeah, I and a lot of what goes into what you had just said about feeling as though it's very insufficient to try to think that you have the answers and then to tell people what the answers are, that you know, that essentially the role of a shaman would be deferred to it would be referred to the group, the spirit of the group, and that it wouldn't be these roles where I'm the person doing this thing. It would just be I'm a participant. We're all participating in this thing, that we have a very forming a clear picture of what we're going towards. That it kind of has to organically unfold through patience of just living your life, because the notion of this instant metanoia, in the way that we picture it, that there might be this instant moment, but that instant moment took all this time to build up to. And so I feel that our project just takes a lot more patience from us, and putting our hubris aside to feel like we know what the right thing is to do. That's really important for me, to not get full of myself and feel that, because I'm very aware that there's a lot that I don't know, and that I have a lot to learn about where I'm falling short, and what I'm missing. So I did have one thing that I wanted to ask you about, that had, a lot of times when I engage with Christians about these topics, it seems that one of the things people will go to is to kind of devalue the intellect, devalue thinking in this way. And I feel like it's kind of a sleight of hand in some way. And so I was wanting to know, like, what you thought about the intellect as like nous, as like the way we kind of wrestle with an idea, and the way that Christians do this, that we use this part of our minds, even if it's not rational, logical, syllogistic processing. Like, I understand that the fault in that, because it's very self-referential and can't get out of some holes that it gets into. But intellect in terms of nous, of like the application of conscious attention, seems to be an unavoidable part, and that when I do it, it's like, well, you doing that thing, and then they do the thing back to me that they are saying that I need to stop doing, and so it's hard for me to. It seems like an inescapable reality that no matter what, even if we engage in that participatory perspectival way where we're just kind of like in it and not thinking very much, that in some way we're applying our minds in the exact same way that thinking does, but it's just a more silent form of contemplation. And so I guess the question would be, how is there some other way to think about that can go outside the category of nous, or of intellect, that there's some other way I can engage with the real in a way that isn't processing in that way, because it just seems like anytime try to do that, it just becomes processing.
Right. Well, let's begin with probably a lot of the Christian traditions that, by virtue of where you've lived, you've butted up against. The anti-intellectualism in American history, and especially in American churches, is a long tradition, and it's sort of easy for academics to scorn it and look down on it, but I think the anti-intellectualism is not too difficult to understand, given the the frontier experience in American history, where the people had a sense that sort of the thinky talky class was disconnected from a broader world by virtue of the power of its civilization. And that then gets translated for some into what I described earlier in terms of the wisdom of a tradition. In other words, anti-intellectualism, ironically, is a process of appropriating a certain mind, a certain nous, a certain tradition, almost by renouncing another tradition of thinking in a particular fashion. In other words, anti-intellectualism can be understood as focus of attention on a particular, mostly implicit body of knowledge, rather than the practices of explicit explication, and that tended to be in the academic world that was critiquing the anti-intellectualism. Now, I think part of what we struggle with as human beings is that, on one hand, and I think Peterson likens this in some ways, especially that talk he did with Roger Scruton. In terms of cognitive science, a lot of what we're always perceiving is always a composite of the internal world and the external world. And what that means is the act of attention, as much as we can give it to something outside and beyond ourselves, is a pretty important piece of knowledge and learning. And but given the fact that we sort of have, I'm going to use two screens, but not in the sense of Scott Adams, seeing as we sort of always have two screens that we're dealing with, one which is the internal and one which is the external, religions tend to almost always be an attempt to negotiate those two objects of attention. And so when you are, for example, in what is your current practice, whether anybody sees it as a renunciating practice where you have to sort of turn your back on all of the ordinary things, or what you're actually doing is sort of an embracing practice, which is giving attention to your children, giving attention to the ground, giving attention to the conversation, that attention will, of course, then form your mind. And the second screen, which is the internal screen of memory, of constructed world, the one always feeds the other.
Yeah.
And so part of really what any religious tradition is a negotiation of those two screens. I don't think I've answered your question. So having said what I said, you might want to reformulate exactly what you're looking for.
No, I think that was a good way to separate that into two categories. Because really it seemed as though if I'm not engaging in truth, trying to find the truth, trying to find the real, in a complete way, where I've only ever known applying this kind of like, putting multiple things together, trying to find consistencies, where like coherence and convergence is like the two main things that make sense, that make things make sense. And there's always this possibility that that somehow there's something outside of that, and in some ways making it the two screens where there's this kind of negotiation between this internal processing and the external processing, definitely makes that something that isn't just singular, where you're not just trapped in this one space where this is the only way that you can look at things. Yeah, I guess for me, I'm confused whether I have, I'm not a naturalist anymore. I don't just think that the material world is all there is. But in some sense, I don't know to what extent that still lives with me. Like I'm not, like, I'm going forward in my life, and I understand the limitations of this, but it seems as though there's something in me that hasn't been convinced otherwise, that still sees things that way, that's kind of like ontologically primary, because it's the thing that seems so self-evident, that all the complexity in organisms, of just like the different parts of their body, and it just seems like there's just something going on here that is not, like what would be the necessity of having all these different like veins or little organs and things like that, in the context of being moral, like where we're put here to just be, and it seems as though like it's hard for me to go into a different space of seeing the world that includes this picture where God creates us, like poof, just puts us here, and that like out of the dirt or whatnot, that it just created man, and that it would give us so many different things like a liver and things like that. Like it just seems like I don't know what exactly I'm trying to express there, but it just seems like all of these like little blocks in my mind are built up that I can't necessarily undo, that I don't know that I should undo them. And I guess I want to have a deeper feeling of connection to this entity, and I want to have a deeper connection to this thing. But it kind of comes back to the thing at the beginning where I don't know what direction to go to make that happen. How do I undo the things in my mind that kind of put me into this place where I just see things as like atoms and just a lot of complexity that doesn't seem to match up with this version of reality that the Bible offers.
I don't know if there's anybody. I mean, I don't know if I hear somebody crying out there. If it's like, if something you need to attend to, or if you're okay.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay. Because I've been there, so I know that sometimes you're in a conversation and it's like, well, there's a crying 1-year-old that must be attended to, and that takes precedence. So there is, by virtue of these are some of my thoughts on, by virtue of how we are, like I said before, those early things get into us as individuals, and they are foundational. And you had very little say over what those foundations would be, probably until you were 8, 10, 12, or 14. Those are all things that, by virtue of who your parents were, where you were raised, and these much longer lineages sort of built into you. And so this naturalism is, for many people today, something very deep. And therefore, because it's very deep, it will not be something that is exercised easily. And I think just understanding that perhaps can give people can perhaps help people be a little easier on themselves, that that's not something that will easily go away. And it's, the irony has been that in previous generations, I've seen the opposite of that, in terms of people who had religious backgrounds that they so much wanted to get away from. But Paul Schrader is one of my favorite go-to examples, although he's actually I think he goes to an Episcopal church. But the Hollywood writer and director, if you watch his movies, he was raised in the Christian Reformed Church and went to Calvin College, and some of his movies, he always seems to be trying to just come to terms with this package that he received before he had any sense of any choice about it. And so whether or not your parents would take you to church once in a while, or even if they identified as atheist, I don't know that if you're raised in this culture, there's a certain element of materialism that you will ever finally exercise in this life. I think just in terms of how we are psychologically, those things are in there. And by the fact that they're in there, we're going to have to come to terms with them one way or another. And I don't think, again, in this life, I think it's, for many people, simply going to be a given. Now, unlike, let's say, some who might say, oh, that's just a horrible, lamentable thing. Well, yeah, well, okay, maybe so, but let's take advantage of what we have, even if we don't like it, and turn some lemons into lemonade, per se. And so for me, I recognized that in myself. And I also recognize the continual secularizing power of whole varieties of things in my life. And I decided to intentionally try to counterbalance it by finding mentors. And as is often the case now, we can have mentors through books or mentors through videos, looking for mentors that could help me probably integrate it into who I was. Because there comes a point where you either integrate, or you assimilate, or you alienate. And I knew I couldn't assimilate, for I had enough meaning crisis in me that simply assimilating into modernity, I saw, was not something that I wanted. Alienate, I don't know that I can actually live better with a certain portion of me alienated as such. And so so for one of the mentors that I chose, which was by no means an unusual mentor, was C.S. Lewis, because C.S. Lewis had been a favorite in evangelicals circles for a long time. Who knows for what reason? Because he's nothing like an American evangelical. I mean, he feels very comfortable with evolutionary ideas. There are whole ranges of Lewis's belief that most evangelicals should probably look at and say, is he really going to be a mentor? Is he really safe? Yet there he is. He's for some reason embraced by the community. But I decided that reading him more thoroughly and repeatedly could help me. And I know that he had done the same thing with George MacDonald, who was a Scotsman from a previous generation, also for whom evangelicals would probably look and say, he's no mentor at all for all of the heterodox ideas that George MacDonald seemed to have. I remember, you tend to forget most of what you learn in school, but I remember one of my seminary professors once saying that, probably in your career, you should probably make a significant theologian. He didn't use these words, but I'll readapt them. You should not probably make a significant theologian a mentor. And the list of possibles that he gave us, given when and where and he was located, was Paul of Tarsus, Augustine, John Calvin, or C.S. Lewis. And the older I get, the more I think, boy, there's an interesting little foursome that he just plopped on to all of us seminary students, but that's sort of the way life goes. So and part of why Lewis has been so helpful for me was that this meaning crisis that Vervaeke has been talking about is not new. And it really accelerated in the Enlightenment, although it certainly is there before the Enlightenment. I think you can actually, in some ways, run its roots all the way back to the Hebrew prophets in their critique of the kinds of religious qualities of their neighbors, and in the perpetual civil war for Israel's faith between those who believed in sort of the radicality of the Deuteronomic tradition in the Old Testament versus those who were basically assimilating into the broader world. And I think Jesus very much stands in that tradition. Jesus appropriates a lot of that. But what Christianity sort of holds is a tension between, let's say, a complete, Lewis would call it, let's say, a nature religion, and then these renunciation religions. And Lewis in his book Miracles sort of shows that these two are sort of the poles that the conversation goes between. And Plato is sort of striving between those poles. And just got to turn on a phone call here. Plato is striving between those poles. And I think a lot of that strife is built into even the naturalism, the Enlightenment naturalism that we are dealing with, because the Enlightenment naturalism sort of brings to expression when Jesus says, it's not what you put into your mouth that makes you unclean, but what comes out of but what's in your heart. You already have, in some ways, an implicit naturalism in there. When the book of Genesis does not encourage its readers to worship the sun or the moon or the waters or the creatures or any of those things, there's in some ways the foundations of naturalism in there that takes a step back from the prevailing assumption in antiquity that one should relate to the sun and the moon and the stars as such, rather than via the creator of all of them. In other words, the naturalism that is in you is itself part of this long conversation about how to deal with this world. And for that reason, integration is probably better than assimilation or alienation, because I don't think you're going to be able to alienate. And I don't think I think the path of assimilation basically leads you to nihilism, which means that at some point you're going to have to hold the tension between these two poles if you're going to successfully engage with the world that is, and in my belief, the God that is, to really, in a sense, flourish in this world, because that is, in fact, the truth of it. So even though it might seem a crisis of I can't unthink or undo this tradition that has been built into me, I don't necessarily find that to be a terminal condition, because I know that others have survived it before.
I agree with that. That was beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, I guess my biggest emotional thing with that is just
hang on a second. I have my own things I got to deal with a second. So I'm just going to pause the recording. I don't know where we left off.
Well, I was, you were talking about that alienation and assimilation. Yeah, we're not going to be viable options. And I guess my hope would just be that trying to integrate is not going to be held against me, that it seems like I can't separate myself from this feeling of obligation to alienate, to like, that it's unacceptable to think materialistically, to see just the material world. Like I'm so conflicted about it, because I can't avoid this feeling of that this God would punish me for not for indulging in that way of seeing the world, even if I couldn't help it. That the idea is, you should have done different, you should have believed different, and just I can't get that out of my head. And I just, every time I try to relax into something of just trying to make this picture work, I feel pulled towards that, because I've been shouted out that I'm going to hell for a good portion of my life, and so it's just like that's really stuck in there. I can't seem to get that out.
I would look at, so there's the story of Elisha and Naaman. Naaman was a general in the Syrian army, he was the top general, and he comes down with leprosy. And one of his slaves, probably captured from Israel, says, "Oh, you should go to Israel where there's Elisha, because he's powerful and he can heal things, even leprosy." So Naaman goes down there, and Elisha doesn't even go out to meet him, just sends Gehazi, his servant, and says, "Go dunk 3 times in the River Jordan, you'll be fine." And Naaman throws a fit, because it's like, no, wait a minute, I came with all this money to pay you, and I'm an important man. And the one of the slaves says to him, "Oh, wait a minute, if Elisha told you to do a hard thing, you do it. Now he's telling you to do a simple thing. Why don't you do it?" And so he goes to the Jordan, he dunks 3 times, and his leprosy is gone. And then he comes
and then I'll text my phone number.
And then he comes to,
I'll text you my phone
and then
number.
Naaman comes back, and he's obviously very grateful for having been healed. And thank you, Cynthia. Yeah. Comes back and is very grateful and wants to give Elisha all this stuff. And Elisha's like, "No, I don't want it." And there's this whole side story with Gehazi, which is beside the point, to my point I want to make now. But then before he leaves, Naaman says, "Now, wait, I have a problem." He says, I am a top general but the king rests his arm on me. And that's both symbolic, but also literal, that the king, when the king goes to the temple and he, I go there with him, I have to bow my knee to this other God. Now, again, this is in the context of this tremendous conflict between Israel and the gods of Syria and the gods of the other nations. And this tremendous conflict of, Israel had better not bow the knee to the Baals or to Dagon or any of these other gods. And Naaman says, I have this dilemma that it's my job. My heart belongs to the Lord, but sometimes I have to go to the pagan temple and bow my knee. And what will this God who has released me from this death sentence of leprosy, what will this God think when I betray him by bowing my knee in the temple? And Elisha basically says, go in peace. He understands. Now, this is in the midst of a struggle. a struggle that's existential for Israel in some ways, between the nature gods and Israel's God. And if Elisha can say to Naaman, the God of heaven and earth can understand the dilemma that you are faced with. Yeah, there's a lot of people yelling at you, that you're going to go to hell, but part of Christianity and part of what Jesus has to say is, judge not that you be not judged. And what he means is not that we ought not to discern, but that we ought not to condemn, because to finally condemn another is to place ourselves in God's seat, God's judgment seat. And that's the height of exactly what Christianity is intended to avoid. So I would say that I don't know that you will be condemned for what you couldn't possibly avoid. And I think that's implicit in many places in the Bible, that we usually give God plenty of reason why he should condemn us. I mean, God doesn't have to go to the extent of looking for, material that he can condemn me based on things I couldn't avoid. I already give him plenty that I can avoid that he could condemn me for. So it sounds like you've got a level of purity in your expectations that I don't think is I don't think comes from Scripture. And so if it's people purporting to speak for Scripture that are condemning you, I would challenge them on that. And now, again, I'm with you in trying to deconstruct a lot of the naturalism that has been implicit in my upbringing. I very much appreciate that and do that too. Yet, I think there's also limited what I'll actually be able to get done. And as I said before, some of that naturalism points to things that I think are properly within the realm of biblical religion, that biblical religionists are not simply nature worshipers and are not simply practitioners of radical renunciation that says all of reality is illusory. I think biblical religion actually holds the tension between both of those positions. So that would be my answer to your fear.
I agree. I find it hard to imagine what like formless existence or heaven or something where there isn't shape and color. Like, what is there to perceive? How could it be a heaven if there's not forms of some sort or something familiar? I mean, it just seems like even the spiritual realm seems to have some of the same elements, or else it wouldn't be anything. It would just be darkness. So there's something inherent about form, about shape and color that is an unavoidable part of reality, and that to kind of denigrate the natural world for the fact that it's a form seems to me to forsake the fact that with no form, like that God created forms so that it has this other space to dwell that's more like concrete, and that was the point. Like was its whole kind of thing that it was doing, is to create forms to express its being. Because I just thought it's a strange question to think of, what is God if it doesn't create anything? Like, what is God alone by itself for all of time? Like, with no time. It just seems like an impossible thing to grok. Like, that its relationship to itself is mediated through the fact that it has a relationship to something else. And so it just seems more crucial, and not just this thing over here that it has little significance to it.
No, I agree. Again, I find Lewis's book Miracles really helpful on this, in terms of navigating between those two poles. And you find it in reality, in informed materiality, that in some ways that's where heaven and earth meet, in real things. There's a way in which this lens cap is a very real thing, and materialists get that right, that there is a reality to this lens cap that is vital and enduring in a way that certain others would not afford. Yet we human beings seem to be creatures of the boundary between these two realities, and figuring out what the relation is between these two realities seems to be a big part of what we are about. And I think Lewis, in his book Miracles, I found it, not everybody, one book is by no means everybody's cup of tea, but for me, that book has been really helpful. And I turn to it again and again when I feel myself, usually when I feel myself falling into my own brand of a meaning crisis. And that book sort of continues to help me sort of sort things out. And it both, on one hand, I think helps me keep my feet on the ground, but also helps me look to heaven. And that's why Lewis, for me, he's the most contemporary of these four that my history professor recommended to me. And I think in this conversation, in this little corner of the internet, has been most helpful, partly because in terms of his own biography, loses his mother at age 6, has a father who is just simply not emotionally equipped to figure out how to raise a son, is sort of fathered in some ways by a hard-nosed Scottish materialist who basically does a new atheist number on Lewis's heart and mind in a really strong way. So Lewis both has an emotional reason to hate God for taking his mother, and an intellectually powerful reason to deny God for having been disproven. But that sort of leaves Lewis, and then of course he goes through the First World War, escapes that with his life, and has to figure out how to live. And he just finds himself being eaten both by certain desires and by nihilism, which I think is very much where a lot of people are at. And it's when he finally gets a job, teaching at the university, where he meets Tolkien and Dyson and some others who are really working hard to put the world together. And that's when Lewis begins to sort of say, this is how I can do it and live. And by no means had an easy life, lived as a bachelor for most of his life, then finally has a strange relationship with a woman. With the time he first meet, she's married, trying to get out of a relationship, and then has sort of a state marriage to give her visa privileges to England. And then eventually, I mean, it's just a weird, strange story, but all of our stories are weird and strange. But for me, he's someone that sort of helps, says, this is how I pieced it together. And he writes so well that a lot of people do piece it together, but they might not be terribly helpful in terms of you because they don't necessarily write well or communicate well or have a point of contact, which is helpful. So that's part of the reason that Lewis is, a go-to guy for me in terms of figuring this all out.
Yeah.
Well, I should probably land the plane because I got to figure out, I've got a person who's trying to cash a check from church and keeps getting rejected, and she's struggling with that. And I want to, and my poor deacon's trying to help her. And so I should probably do a little Living Stones work.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you though, is the picture that I formed together, does it seem like a coherent problem? I'm running on low sleep, so I'm trying to I don't know how chaotic any of that was.
No, your picture is, and as I said in the video I made, it's very common in that we have an entire generation that is dealing with exactly what you're dealing with. And for some reason, by virtue possibly of, everything that I've, how this whole strange little corner in the internet has formed, there are many people who are wrestling with exactly what you're wrestling with. That you realize that this naturalism is no way to live. It isn't sustaining. It's not for human beings. And yet the institutions and communities that are commonly available to them don't quite fit either. And there are problems in many of them. When I first started this thing, I'd say, well, go to a church. And people would write back to me and said, yeah, I tried going to a church, but this is what happened. It's like, yeah, I guess that doesn't really surprise me either. Which is why, we've talked about estuary and try to at least give people conversation partners. So in your struggles, at least you're not alone, because these things are too hard for any individual. I mean, Lewis is tremendously brilliant man. He couldn't figure it out. And, without Tolkien, who of course had wrestled another World War I vet who had his own meaning crisis and had to piece things together. And Lewis, I mean, Tolkien became a Catholic to piece it together. Lewis never became a Catholic. He remained an Anglican. And that could be because of his North Ireland roots. I mean, who knows? But we're all coming at this thing, and none of us can do it alone. And so part of what I have wanted to do, at least, is do what I can to help people find each other. And, of course, people are complex bundles of everything. And so that's not necessarily too helpful, but hopefully in the midst with talking to each other and listening to each other, we can help each other find our way out of this meaning crisis. And again, for me, I'm blessed by when and to whom I was born to probably have less difficulty navigating the church and some of these issues. Although I'm certainly not immune to it, but I want to help people find one another, because I mean, I can help you with little pieces, but there'll be other things that you need that I can't help you with, because I've not had to wrestle with them. And so that's why we need networks and communities where we can work on these things together.
I agree. Well, it's been a lovely conversation.
Is this something that, would you like to review it before I'd publish it, or do you think it's okay to go out, or do you want to keep it?
Yeah, I'm fine with it. However,
Okay.
yeah, you can put it out.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, no, and I wish I had more. I wish I had more time right now, but I'm leaving town next week, and dealing with dealing with life as it is. But thank you for your excellent comment. And yeah, we've done one server, which is the Bridges of Meaning Discord server that we have right now. We're currently working on sort of the next iteration of it. But the whole Estuary project and Bridges of Meaning project have been the desire to, in fact, help people find relationships and conversation partners and spaces to not have the kind of question shutting down experience that churches often afford. But obviously, by me being a Christian minister, I don't want my project to be antithetical or alienating on either side. In other words, I don't want the atheists to say, that's too churchy. And I don't want the church people to say, that's, that's all about apostasy.
Yeah, right.
I'd like there to be a boundary water. I'd like there to be an estuary where, because I believe, of course, if I wouldn't be on the internet doing this if I didn't believe it, that the church has something to offer. But I'm also fully aware that not every church might be helpful to every single person. And it's for that reason that we have this diversity of churches. I think God's kingdom is there are the Orthodox and the Catholics and the Protestants, and how many kinds of all of them and many of us are struggling with these things. And so I hope that Estuary is a place where people can come to compare notes and practice that dialogos, where each of us leaves the conversation. Maybe we're not agreeing on whole ranges of things, but both of us can leave the conversation and say, well, that helped me. It didn't solve it, but I found a few nuggets in there that, yeah, I'm putting little pieces in, and hopefully after working on this for a number of years, I'll make progress. That's what we're hoping for.
Little bit of clean water in a dirty cup.
A little bit of clean. That sounds good. That sounds good. Well, thank you, Ryan. And again, I wish I had more time right now, but I'm glad at least we had this chance to talk, and hopefully we can talk and meet at some other point.
I would love that.
Okay.
I'll check out the Discord.
Okay. Thanks, Ryan.
Safe travels.
Okay. Bye-bye.